Welcome back, Star Wars fans, to Coruscant Radio Underground here on the Science Fictionary. I'm Andrew, and we're going to talk about the Acolyte. Of course, we've already done that. We've talked about the Acolyte. We've done full reviews, so have many of the other shows here on the Red 5 Network. There's a lot of great reviews out there if you want to go check those out and see what we thought about the show as far as our opinions on what we thought was good, what we thought was bad. But that's not what we're doing here tonight. I'm going to take a different approach to this. So if you watched my reviews, you know that I largely didn't like the show. And I'm going to get into the reason that I had such a negative reaction to it, especially that final episode. So this is going to be a little different than a typical critique. It's on a more fundamental level than that. So what this really boils down to, before I start getting into it, is we're going to walk through what George Lucas's intentions for Star Wars were as a fairy tale, as a fantasy story. What was it that George Lucas wanted to give to the world through his creation? And then we're gonna take that and we're gonna look at the moral relativism of the Acolyte. And so for those of you who don't know that terminology, it's a postmodernist idea that there's no universal or absolute set of moral principles. It's a flawed worldview. And even most of your atheistic thinkers who really promoted this idea will acknowledge that it's problematic. It's hard to adhere to a worldview that says nothing really matters, then you can't make moral truth claims. What you will find with most people who claim a morally relativistic belief system is that they still make truth claims all the time. You see it on a particular side of the political spectrum in this country more often than not. And it's this idea that you can do whatever you want. There's not really anything right or wrong. The problem is that they will call things right or wrong on the regular. They make truth claims. Moral relativism stands opposed basically to any and all theological belief, whether it be Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, or any other number of major world religions. I specifically chose those three because those are the three primary religions that George Lucas used to influence his ideas of spirituality in Star Wars. Now, a lot of people also have this belief that George was promoting Star Wars as some sort of analogy for Vietnam or World War II or a number of other world events, and that certain characters are representative of people in the real world, and that might be partially true to an extent. But we'll see through some of his quotes that we're going to go through here in a minute that, yes, he pulled things from the real world all the time, just like Tolkien did. He pulled things from the real world. He didn't just invent them out of the ether. He pulled from the real world to create situations, scenarios, characters, governments, religions, basically to build the framework for his story. George Lucas set out to create something that presented a positive moral message and wasn't promoting a specific religion. Again, he built the religion in Star Wars, the spirituality of Star Wars, by a meshing of real world religions, mostly based on the moral grounds presented in those religions. And he wanted to share a message of doing good and avoiding evil. So that's my premise here tonight. I'm going to walk through a number of George Lucas quotes, and I have a particular quote here that I want to use to open it up. So, quoting George Lucas, "I was afraid that science fiction buffs and everybody would say things like, there's no sound in outer space. I just wanted to forget science. That would take care of itself. Stanley Kubrick made the ultimate science fiction movie, and it's going to be very hard for somebody to come along and make a better movie as far as I'm concerned. I didn't want to make it 2001. I wanted to make a space fantasy that was more in the genre of Edgar Rice Burroughs, that whole other end of space fantasy that was there before science took it over in the 50s. Once the atomic bomb came, everybody got into monsters and science, and what would happen with this and what would happen with that. I think speculative fiction is very valid, but they forgot the fairy tales and the dragons and Tolkien and all the real heroes." I think that's a pretty straightforward explanation of what George hoped to accomplish with Star Wars. If we want to talk a little bit about what fairy stories and what fairy tales are, I'm going to defer first to pretty much the foremost expert on fairy tales and the creator of the modern fantasy myth with J.R.R. Tolkien. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it. tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. And that is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien on fairy stories. Make sure I say that right. So from there, I want to take a quick look at what makes a fairy tale. We've already seen that Lucas set out to create something of a modern fairy tale. Now let's look at why he wanted to create a modern fairy tale. So again, quoting George Lucas, young people today don't have a fantasy life anymore. Not the way we did, Lucas once stated. All they've got is Kojak and Dirty Harry. All the films they see are movies of disasters and insecurity and realistic violence. Young people, he added, no longer have fairy tales. I put this little thing on it. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Basically, it's a fairy tale now. Star Wars is built on top of many things that came before. This film is a compilation of all of those dreams, using them as a history to create a new dream. And there you go. And this is why George Lucas wanted to create a fairy tale, as well as his thoughts on how he envisioned his usage of real-world references. They're not one-to-one. They're not meant to be taken that way. And for people that like to look at other people and say, yeah, you're politically the enemy that Lucas was talking about, that's not Lucas's point. You're missing the point altogether. This is a story of good versus evil. And it had a very, very specific purpose in George Lucas's mind. So let's take a look at another quote. It's about good and evil. But heroes, what makes a hero? What's friendship? What's the idea of sacrificing yourself for something larger? They're all really basic things, and you say, we don't have to make a movie about it. It's very obvious, but it's actually not. It's not that obvious to a lot of people unless you have somebody tell you every generation that this is what our country believes. And this is the way that fairy tales were meant to function. Fairy tales, folk stories, even going back to our ancient myths. There's a reason we still read these myths. We connect with them on a basic level. Is this whole idea of the hero's journey, but the danger of slipping into moral relativism is that these stories no longer have meaning. Good and evil no longer have meaning. Now, we've established that George set out to create a fairy tale to instill ideas of doing good, to create ideas of good and evil and self-sacrifice. So what defines a fairy tale? So literarydevices.net says the following. A fairy tale functions as a tool for the writers to express their thoughts freely through animal or other imaginary characters. Its major purpose is to entertain, pass on culture, thoughts, and convey different moral ideas to the young generation. It provides the audience with an opportunity to become lighthearted and enjoy something different. Also, fairy tale stories help children learn moral values, as they are a convenient device to boost a child's imagination and cultural literacy. Writers skillfully feature certain situations to make their audiences feel happy and lighthearted over happy endings of such stories. And then we also have a checklist here of what makes a fairy tale. And I want you to pay attention because these characteristics, it could pretty much be an outline for creating Star Wars. One, they have fantastical elements and characters with magical powers. Fairies, wizards, witches, and mythic beasts are common. Two, they are set in an imaginary faraway land. The setting is usually vague, such as a kingdom far, far away. Three, they have a clearly defined good and evil characters. The hero and villain archetypes are strong in fairy tales. Four, they teach a moral lesson. Fairy tales often end with the villain getting a punishment and the hero living happily ever after. 5, they use repetitive elements and phrases. Numbers like 3 and 7 reoccur, along with phrases like once upon a time and happily ever after. And the last point here, they have a simple imaginative narrative. The plot of a fairy tale tends to be simple and linear. And there we have it. So now we've established that what a fairy tale is And if you were paying attention, you realize that those things are pretty much describing Star Wars. It's describing exactly what George Lucas set out to create in 1977, a fairy tale. And so based on this final quote, I'm going to pull up, I believe that the messaging of the Acolyte, let's forget everything else about it and just look at the messaging of the thing. I believe the messaging of this story is evil. Now, I'm hinging that on a couple of things, but primarily that it really twists the concepts of what is good and evil in this story. There are points in the Acolyte where we get heroic fanfare moments for the villains. There are no apparent negative consequences for this character that's using the dark side, and Star Wars has established that there are consequences to using the dark side. This is why the whole concept of Grey Jedi doesn't work. So let's take a look at this last quote that I've got here from George Lucas. Or we will try. I will get it up here eventually. It's a film for 12-year-olds. This is what we stand for. You're about to enter the real world. You're moving away from your parents. You're probably scared and you don't know what's going to happen. Here's what you should pay attention to. Friendships, honesty, trust, doing the right thing, living on the light side, avoiding the dark side. That's real simple. And the messaging of the Acolyte is that those things no longer matter, that the dark side can be heroic, that the dark side can be good. The Acolyte presents us, and wait, before you say, oh, no, that's the villain's mantra, like kill the past mantra from the sequels. Sure, that's the villain's mantra. That's not really the purpose of the films. In fact, they come around through Luke's eyes primarily that no, we don't have to kill the past. So that's the villain's mantra. It's not a reliable narrative. Now in Star Wars, we have villains who often think they're doing the right thing and doing good things. That's normal. It's normal to present villains that way. Villains, real life and otherwise, often believe that they're doing the right thing. That's fine. That's actually believable. So I don't mind that the villain in the story thinks that he's good. However, now you've got the actor, Manny Jacinto, out there saying that his character is chaotic good. The character's a Sith. Sith characters are not good. And that confusion is the problem that I have with this show. That's their messaging, that the Sith is the good guy. And while the villain can be an unreliable narrator, and sometimes your hero can even be an unreliable narrator, but in Star Wars, we have a reliable narrator. At least we did up until this show. That reliable narrator in Star Wars is an unseen character. It's the music. The music of Star Wars is built on themes and motifs, and it tells us how to feel. It gives us our cues. It informs us about characters and situations. So giving the villain a triumphant fanfare multiple times in the final episode of The Acolyte cements what they were trying to say. That it's a purely morally relativistic story that does not jive with everything Star Wars that came before it. Not just George Lucas's Star Wars. The Acolyte doesn't jive with the Star Wars we've had under Disney's branding either. Suddenly we've allowed people to tell stories that because it was supposed to be from the Sith's point of view, that we can present the Sith as a hero. But the music can't lie. The themes and motifs can't lie. And the themes of the music are telling us that this is a heroic moment, that it's a good moment, and that is a horrible, terrible mistake. So in conclusion, I want to say that The Acolyte is a slap in the face to everything that George Lucas set out to create. It's a slap in the face to all the people that grew up with Star Wars. Those original kids that saw it back in 1977, the generation of kids like me that grew up on it and were affected by it, and that have shared it with our kids again. I wouldn't want my kids watching The Acolyte without some moral guidance to explain what the problems with it are. So I see it as a slap in the face to George, a slap in the face to longtime fans, but it's not only a slap in the face to this new generation of 12-year-olds that are coming up and watching this stuff. It's a betrayal. And as part of the story that's supposed to tell them and help shape them as they prepare to move away from their parents and move into the real world, to do good, to seek good, to avoid dark, that self-sacrifice can be a good thing, and that chasing something bigger than you is a good thing. A morally relativistic worldview says that none of that matters. Telling the next generation of kids that nothing matters, that none of it matters, that good doesn't matter, that evil doesn't matter, and that somehow the two are basically the same thing, that is evil. And that's where I'm going to leave it tonight. I want to hear your thoughts in the chat. I want to know if you think I'm completely off base here. I want to know what you think about the moral relativism presented in the Acolyte. But that's going to do it for me here tonight. So until next time, guys, live on the light side, avoid the dark side, and may the Force be with you.
This podcast is a member of the Red 5 Network. For more Red 5 Network podcasts and content creators, visit bio.link/Red5.